there can be no negotiation if if he's looking for a peace deal. You have to include the warring parties. Ukraine is a defending party, but it's a warring party, and so for him to conclude a peace deal um, with just one member of the sort of conflict is sort of an absurdity. And of course, this afternoon, Vladimir Zelensky made it very clear that there could be no peace deal unless he's involved, and that's sort of an obvious statement to make. And I'm sure that when Trump and his advisors sort of regroup to see how this all landed, they'll understand that completely, because you can't. It's a meaningless exercise for Putin to go meet, or Trump to go meet Putin in Saudi Arabia and have various conversations if those conversations don't lead to an agreement. An agreement has to involve the parties that need to agree.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today, we're going to speak to Sir Bill Browder about the phone conversation, the 90-minute phone conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. This is the first known conversation the two leaders have had, and they spoke about various things, but the main topic of concern is how we end the war in Ukraine and what Vladimir Putin wants, and how Trump will broker a ceasefire between the two countries. We're speaking to Bill also about the Munich Security Conference, because he's there this weekend, and there'll be so much that goes on there. So all that today on the Trump Report. So Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today and for joining the Trump Report. We've had a big day. We've finally had this phone conversation, well, the first known conversation we know about between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, finally confirmed by both the Kremlin and the White House. What were your big takeaways from this 90-minute conversation?
Well, the first thing I make of it is that it's that Putin, an indicted war criminal, a totally isolated mass murderer who invaded a foreign peaceful neighbor, who's been isolated for the last 3 years completely and absolutely, all of a sudden had a 1.5-hour telephone conversation with the most powerful man in the free world, President of the United States. That by itself is an enormous, huge victory for Putin. All of a sudden, he comes in from the cold. He's welcomed by President Trump, and I think that's particularly upsetting when you look at how he treated Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who he then called up afterwards to inform him of the telephone call. And the I would say the sort of body language of the whole thing really made me feel upset. And I think a lot of other people, including the Ukrainians and including President Zelensky.
Is this because in this conversation, Trump basically, after he wrote a big Truth Social post, basically saying that when negotiations get involved, actually start to kick into gear, there's a chance that Zelensky won't be involved. There's a chance that Ukraine won't be involved. So much to say that he said that him and Putin are willing to visit each other's nations. They're actually willing to go to Russia, and for Putin to be hosted by Trump in the United States, both of which have not been done in years. But he's apprehensive about going to Ukraine. So my question, Bill, is this is quite bizarre that Vladimir Zelensky is so excluded from something that is about his country.
Well, I mean, there can be no negotiation if he's looking for a peace deal. You have to include the warring parties. Ukraine is a defending party, but it's a warring party, and so for him to conclude a peace deal with just one member of the sort of conflict is sort of an absurdity. And of course, this afternoon, Vladimir Zelensky made it very clear that there could be no peace deal unless he's involved, and that's sort of an obvious statement to make. And I'm sure that when Trump and his advisors sort of regroup to see how this all landed, they'll understand that completely, because you can't. It's a meaningless exercise for Putin to go meet, or Trump to go meet Putin in Saudi Arabia and have various conversations if those conversations don't lead to an agreement. An agreement has to involve the parties that need to agree.
But do you think that Donald Trump will go over Zelensky's head and try and meet with Putin to discuss a ceasefire, because he thinks he's obviously the most powerful man in the world right now? Does this come down to Trump's ego that he'd be the guy that gets this deal done?
Well, that's how he's presented himself all through his campaign. He promised that the war would be he would end the war in 24 hours, and it wouldn't have started without him, and so on and so forth. Um, and so, I mean, he may very well. I mean, he has announced that it's his intention to go and meet Putin in Saudi Arabia. So that may happen. But I mean, this is a complicated situation. Him having a meeting with Putin doesn't do anything. Putin can say what he wants to say. Trump can say what he wants to say. But the Ukrainians have a lot to say. The Europeans have a lot to say. Um, and so, at the end of the day, there's a lot of people involved in this thing, particularly because at the same time as Trump was having his 1.5 hour phone call with Putin, the defense secretary was meeting with European defense ministers in NATO, and he was saying that whatever happens, it's going to be European boots on the ground defending the peace treaty, not American. So it's not as if you can have all these demands without having the parties that you're demanding show up and participate and either say yes or no, or under this condition or that condition. So it's all a bit sort of amateurish if you look at it at this stage of the game. And that's how most of these announcements have been. They want Greenland. We're going to buy Greenland. The Panama Canal. All this stuff has been very sort of half cocked. And then the reality sets in, and I'm sure that's going to be the case here. This is the parties that are involved here, Russia and Ukraine, are stuck in this war, and just having a meeting doesn't unstuck them from this war.
No, absolutely. Nothing major has happened except a phone call, and it's important to not get ahead of ourselves. But if Trump's ego takes the expense from Ukraine, and Trump's, he wants to stop spending so much foreign aid on Ukraine, he wants to stop spending so much military aid over there, and he just wants the war to be done. It begs the question, Bill, if he does have another meeting with Putin, is there a chance he could sign off on that 2024 peace deal that Vladimir Putin proposed, which would say that Russia gets to keep all the areas of Ukraine that they've occupied, which is nearly 20% of Ukraine currently, and that officially Ukraine will not be allowed into NATO, even though we saw Pete Hegseth say that it's very unlikely that Ukraine will go into NATO?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, Putin actually controls every bit of this whole situation. Putin could decide to stop where he is. He could decide to pull back. He could decide to carry on fighting. And so Putin is the invader. Zelensky is just trying to protect his country. And so perhaps Trump can convince Putin, not to further invade. Now, at the end of the day, he's got to get some agreement from the other side. And so this is a complicated story that's not going to get resolved in 24 hours or one meeting in Saudi Arabia. This is a story that's going to require a lot of different people with a lot of different interests. And by the way, the one piece of leverage that Trump has here is that America has been a very big funder of financial and military aid for Ukraine, and he could cut that off. I think that's his big leverage. However, the other piece of leverage, which hasn't been used yet, is that there's $300 billion of frozen Russian assets in the West. Most of that money is not in America. I think only 13 billion, or maybe even less, is in America. Most of that money is in Europe. And so Europe actually has a big seat at this table. If Europe were to decide to confiscate that money and use that money to defend Ukraine, then Trump's threat of withdrawing military aid is an empty threat, and he can't force an unsatisfactory deal on Ukraine. And I think that has to be the position that Europe takes right now, which is that they should be in the driver's seat. This affects Europe much more than it affects America. This is something that's happening, within this continent, and I think that has to be the position that goes forward with Macron and Starmer and whoever the new German chancellor is, which is, yes, this is our negotiation, or this is a negotiation that has to be done with us.
And we can't leave it all into the hands of Trump. But Bill, you're in Munich for the security conference this weekend, and that $300 billion is quite a divisive subject when it comes to Europe. Various countries are on both sides. Some of the EU does want to confiscate it, some don't. Zelensky wants all of the money to be put into funding his military aid. Where do you think by the end of the weekend, do you think that this is a topic that's going to be discussed? You're going to be surrounded by a lot of world leaders, and Ukraine-Russia war will be top agenda.
This is the topic that I'm going to discuss, which, and by the way, whoever was objecting to it before needs to consider that if Putin wins in Ukraine, which is entirely possible if Trump cuts off military aid, there's going to be 20 million Ukrainian refugees fleeing the country all over Europe. And then when Putin makes a move on Estonia, there's going to then be Estonian refugees, and there's going to be then Latvia goes, and then Poland, and so I mean this is an existential crisis for Europe. And so whatever objections there were before, I think we're in a new world right now.
If you get to the end of the weekend or negotiations, deliberations over what to do with this $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets, Europe does decide to confiscate it and put it into the hands of Zelensky's army or whatever they want to do in order to stop Putin. How much of a dent will this $300 billion or however much of that chunk Europe has will make to focusing on ending the war? Will it make a massive difference?
Well, what it will do is put Ukraine in a position so they can end the war on their terms, when and how they want to. So they're not forced into ending the war in a situation where it's against their will. They can, and so they're defending. Putin is attacking. The money is used for their defense, and then they can decide when and how to negotiate instead of being forced by someone who's really not at all sensitive to their issues, making decisions for them.
Bill? What do you think the downside is currently in this situation we're currently in? It looks like everything is falling in Donald Trump's hands, as we know he would like it to. What right now are the downfalls of having this entire situation fall into the hands of Donald Trump's and his team's negotiating skills with Russia?
Well, it's not about negotiating skills. It's about the position that they're taking, and the position that they're taking seems to be one in which they're granting Putin all sorts of privileges which he doesn't deserve. And Putin is a war criminal. He's an indicted war criminal. And so for them to be treating him as if he's some kind of VIP, I think does a great disservice to everybody who's been defending against Russian aggression.
The conversation that Trump and Putin had was that the first initial meeting face-to-face that they might have will A, not have Zelensky there, but B, probably take place in Saudi Arabia with the presence of the Crown Prince there. Whether or not he's mediating, not quite sure. But why Saudi Arabia, and why would the Prince be present for that?
Well, Putin has an indictment over his head, and there's many countries that would have to arrest him if he showed up there. And so Saudi Arabia is a country where he wouldn't be arrested. So I think that's the reason why it's Saudi Arabia. And of course, Trump has got a very close relationship with Mohammed bin Salman.
So when Putin says that he is considering visiting the United States, he really can't, because he's a war criminal and he's wanted for war crimes.
Well, I mean, he's going to hopefully in his own mind, I should say, not hopefully in my mind, but hopefully he's going to get some kind of assurances if he ever visits the United States. And I think that's a long way off. That's a sort of fantasy. I think the American public is not ready to have a sort of state dinner with Vladimir Putin attending, no matter what the position of Trump and some of his cabinet is.
Well, we know he's not safe outside of Russia, but at this present time, Bill, how safe is Vladimir Putin inside Russia? Has he been targeted at all right now? Is there any sort of assassination attempts unfolding?
No, Putin is killing off anybody who might think about that long before they think about that. He's the most paranoid little man out there. He knows that people want to kill him, and he's making sure that they die before he does.
A lot of people, Bill, do wonder if the situation occurred where Vladimir Putin was assassinated. Does he have such a large following in his team that the way Russia is dictated will continue?
Well, I think that all those people around him have stolen a lot of money. I mean, huge, huge amounts of money. and they would be desperately afraid that if he died, that whoever came in, if they didn't control that person, would take their money away from them because that's how the world works in the jungle of Russia. And so I think there's a strong financial incentive among all the people around Putin to have a status quo successor. Whether they succeed in finding that person, whether that person has the can instill the fear in Russian people the way that Putin has, is an unknown. But that's certainly their intention if he were to suddenly drop dead of a heart attack tonight.
Bill, just a final few questions. This week we saw an American detained prisoner, Mark Fogel, finally be returned after a few years in a Russian prison. He was there for possession of marijuana, and the Trump administration got him out because he wasn't really considered a wrongful detainee under the Biden administration. For Trump's top negotiator, Steve Witkoff, to have travelled to Russia and brokered this deal with Putin actually directly, what do you think this says currently about the state of the relationship between the United States and Russia?
Well, what it shows is that Putin is trying to throw out a few goodies to Trump in order to kind of pave the way to a deal in which he can get the better of Ukraine, and by releasing a couple hostages is a small price to pay for that.
But what did Russia get out of this deal, Bill? Because we know that obviously Mark Fogel is back in the US, but we don't know anything public about the prisoner exchange. We don't know who the US released back to Russia.
We actually do know that there has been several prisoners released. There was there was a Russian hacker, and from what I understand, there was also several. There was a Radio Free Europe correspondent who was in jail in Belarus who was also released. So this was a little more complicated than just a favor for Trump. But this guy Fogel was definitely wrongly detained. He had done nothing wrong. I mean, he was a high school teacher and smoked a little pot, I think, for medical purposes, and he ended up getting this 10-year sentence. And I don't know why he wasn't included in the previous prisoner swap. I don't know why the Biden administration didn't name him wrongly detained until almost after they finished. But it's a nice thing that he's home. However, whatever the circumstances were, but I would hope that by swapping him out, it doesn't lead to the Trump administration throwing Ukraine under the bus.
Absolutely. So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll be checking back in with you on Monday after the security conference.
Thank you.